The calendar marked the 5th of May in 1945, with the military chronometer displaying 07 hours and 20 minutes. The location was Wageningen, situated in the western regions of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Staff Sergeant William Cooper, serving with distinction in the 101st Airborne Division, positioned himself at the boundary separating the American military formations from the quaint settlement below, as the mechanized columns of Allied warriors navigated through the narrow thoroughfares of this modest Dutch community. He observed the indigenous population gradually materializing from behind their residential doorways. Throughout his deployment across the European continent, Cooper had previously participated in similar liberation scenarios. He recalled the triumphant atmosphere that greeted American forces throughout the French territories, the Belgian territories, and the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. The customary pattern involved enthusiastic demonstrations from grateful inhabitants, the unfurling of patriotic banners, vociferous expressions of joy, and frequently the generous dispensation of alcoholic beverages coupled with affectionate gestures from women of the locality. Nevertheless, the panorama unfolding before him triggered an unexpected emotional response that momentarily paralyzed his senses. The inhabitants emerging into the thoroughfare exhibited none of the anticipated jubilant demeanor. Rather, they progressed with sluggish, laborious movements suggestive of profound physical deterioration. The elderly shuffled forward as though burdened by the accumulation of countless decades. Their corporeal forms bent and weakened. Adults provided mutual support to one another, their balance precarious and their strength depleted. Most strikingly, the juvenile population resembled spectral apparitions rather than living children. Their corporeal forms appeared diminished, their vital essence seemingly drained by prolonged deprivation. Standing in isolation beside the thoroughfare through which the American mechanized transport proceeded was a female child, approximately 7 rotations of the Earth in age, garbed in a textile covering that bore the unmistakable evidence of numerous alterations, designed to accommodate her progressively diminishing bodily proportions. Her visage exhibited skeletal prominence, with optical organs disproportionately enlarged within hollowed cranial cavities, lending her countenance an otherworldly appearance. Her lower limbs resembled nothing so much as desiccated timber encased within wooden pedal coverings. That doubtless represented her sole footwear possession. As the motorized transport conveying Cooper came to a cessation, the youthful feminine figure gathered sufficient resolve to advance hesitantly in the direction of the American military personnel. Her optical attention remained fixed upon the uniformed soldiers with an expression that synthesized desperate anticipation with the circumspection of an individual who had internalized harsh lessons regarding the unreliability of human kindness. Her countenance remained devoid of the typical facial configurations associated with celebration or pleasure. She maintained an essentially motionless posture, her bodily frame undulating with barely perceptible movements, apparently depleted of the vitality requisite for more vigorous physical demonstration. Cooper extended his manual appendage into the fabric receptacle he carried and extracted a concentrated nutrition bar, a staple provision distributed to military personnel. He descended from his elevated position and extended the comestible item toward the juvenile female, her gaze remaining fixed upon the offering without immediate physical response. During a momentary interval, he entertained the hypothesis that perhaps the youthful recipient lacked comprehension of the object's nature and purpose. Subsequently, however, her upper extremity executed a sudden projection, capturing the nutritional substance and drawing it to her thoracic region with the intensity of one securing an invaluable treasure of immeasurable worth. Crystalline fluid commenced its descent across the contours of her emaciated facial features. The juvenile articulated expressions of gratitude in the English linguistic form, though her acoustic delivery barely exceeded the threshold of auditory perception. Appreciation, she communicated, the monosyllabic utterance repeated with increasing emotional intensity. Appreciation, appreciation, appreciation. The spatial region posterior to the young recipient's position commenced experiencing an influx of additional juvenile entities. Quantitatively, the numerical accumulation attained proportions encompassing 20, perhaps 30, potentially 40 individual youthful organisms, each exhibiting the physiological characteristics associated with severe nutritional deficiency, each directing their optical faculties toward the American military contingent. With that identical amalgamation of desperate optimism and incredulous astonishment, Cooper directed his visual attention toward the assembled military personnel, operating under his supervisory capacity, his own physiological features registering profound perturbation. as the neurological implications of the tableau before them achieved conscious recognition. The corporeal consequences of extended periods of nutritional inadequacy had manifested themselves with devastating completeness upon this juvenile population. The commanding officer articulated directives in subdued tones, communicating an imperative for the liberation and distribution of all available nutritional provisions currently maintained within the military assemblage. The ensuing temporal sequence involved orchestrated chaos of the most redemptive character. The armed military personnel commenced the systematic allocation of every consumable provision within their possession. Juvenile organisms clutched at chocolate products and crispy cereal-based items, and metallic containers encompassing animal protein, their optical expressions transformed by overwhelming emotional intensity. Parents descended onto their lower extremities in postures of profound obeisance, their vocal expressions communicating inexpressible gratitude. The physiologically and psychologically hardened military personnel, conditioned through extended combat experiences, underwent a profound transformation in their comprehension of meaningful human endeavor. The act of facilitating nutritional access to starving juvenile organisms surpassed in significance and emotional impact the cumulative total of their previous military accomplishments. The multitudinous combative engagements they had previously navigated, the territorial acquisitions they had secured, the adversarial forces they had neutralized all seemed diminished when juxtaposed against the fundamental humanitarian action of ensuring survival for imperiled children, for the Dutch indigenous populations inhabiting the western regions of the Netherlands, who had endured the catastrophic nutritional deficiency spanning from 1944 through 1945. The arrival of American liberators represented something far more profound than the mere acquisition of military advantages or the restoration of autonomous governance mechanisms. The arrival signified the procurement of nutritional sustenance for juvenile organisms, whose biological existence hung precariously in the balance, suspended between survival and termination. The arrival meant termination of the anguishing spectacle of witnessing one's own biological offspring progressively wasting away, while possessing complete inability to implement corrective interventions. The arrival constituted the transformative moment when optimism, which had undergone gradual extinction through months of intentional systemic deprivation, unexpectedly and miraculously experienced restoration. The methodology employed by German occupation forces represented considerably more than an incidental catastrophe or an unfortunate byproduct of military conflict. Rather, it constituted calculated political strategy orchestrated by the occupying regime with deliberate intention to inflict maximum suffering upon the civilian population.
The deliberate starvation campaign, recognized historically as the Hunger Winter catastrophe, transformed the western territories of the Netherlands into a region of systematic devastation, spanning the temporal interval commencing in September 1944 and concluding in May 1945. This phenomenon emerged neither from natural calamity nor from the unfortunate consequences inherent to armed confrontation. Instead, it represented explicitly formulated German occupational authority doctrine, specifically engineered to inflict punitive consequences upon the indigenous Dutch populace for their demonstrated sympathy toward allied military operations and to magnify collective suffering throughout the ultimate phases of occupation. The quantitative dimensions of this catastrophe, meticulously documented through archival materials and official records, illuminate the magnitude of calculated brutality. The Dutch civilian demographic residing within the Western Netherlands numbered approximately 4,500,000 individuals. The aggregate mortality attributable specifically to nutritional deprivation reached quantifications spanning from 18,000 to 22,000 individual fatalities. Among the juvenile demographic, the documented mortality ranged between 2,500 and 3,000 individual deaths. The pediatric demographic manifesting symptoms of acute malnutrition at the culmination of the crisis encompassed approximately 200,000 juvenile organisms. The nutritional caloric disbursement that existed by February 1945 declined to a range between 400 and 800 calories distributed to each individual inhabitant per diurnal cycle. The provisioning of foodstuffs experienced complete cessation for extended periods. Throughout the early months of 1945, the thermal fuel reserves accessible for environmental temperature regulation became essentially non-existent by the commencement of January 1945. The precipitating event originated in September 1944 when the governmental administration operating in exile from Dutch territories, initiated proclamations mandating the discontinuation of railway operations throughout the territory. This maneuver designed specifically to facilitate the military operations of the Allied powers, pursuing their objective. Following the unsuccessful execution of the Market Garden Tactical Initiative, the German occupation governance instituted immediate retaliation through the implementation of comprehensive nutritional embargo, specifically targeting the Western Netherlands region, systematically strangling the provisioning channels, directing sustenance toward this geographically concentrated population zone, encompassing the nation's densest demographic concentration. The temporal alignment of this restrictive measure proved catastrophically unfortunate. The embargo implementation occurred precisely as meteorological conditions transitioned toward frigid winter months, the temporal epoch when populations traditionally depend upon accumulated foodstuff reserves obtained from autumnal harvests. The transportation infrastructure remained incapacitated due to ongoing railway suspension. Simultaneously, German military command obstructed land-based distribution mechanisms, thereby transmuting the Western Netherlands into an isolated geographic expanse, virtually devoid of nutritional commodities. Existing provisions, accumulated through whatever means inhabitants could devise, experienced rapid depletion within a compressed temporal framework, with absolutely no mechanism for replenishment or redistribution. The German occupation governance apparatus demonstrated methodical unconcern regarding the humanitarian catastrophe engulfing the civilian demographic. In treaties for provisioning relief encountered systematic dismissal or explicit prohibition. Petitions directed toward worldwide humanitarian organizations experienced systematic blockade by German military command. The intentional methodology became unmistakably articulated within military communications, originating from German command hierarchies. The Dutch civilian populations demonstrated willingness to assist. Allied military endeavors would precipitate punitive nutritional deprivation calibrated to generate illustrative instruction regarding the consequences attending resistance against occupational authority. The foundational deterioration commenced with a methodical succession of escalating desperation, meticulously documented through personal testimonial accounts, written correspondence, and survivor narratives that persisted through the post-war interval. The progression from adequate provisioning toward catastrophic shortage manifested gradually, at initial stages, subsequently accelerating into crisis proportions, as sequential thresholds of desperation were surpassed. During the temporal interval spanning September through October 1944, rationing arrangements tightened noticeably, though the reduced quantities maintained bare adequacy for survival. Family units consumed accumulated provisions retained from previous abundance, harboring optimistic expectations that the embargo would demonstrate brief duration, maintaining behavioral normalcy notwithstanding the manifest shortages constraining their existence. The interval spanning November through December 1944 witnessed nutritional allocation diminishing precipitously beneath physiological sustenance thresholds. Family aggregations initiated consumption of every substance remotely suitable for human intake. Wooden domestic furnishings underwent combustion to generate thermal energy. Horticultural plots were systematically stripped of every botanically consumable element. Domesticated animals were eliminated and processed for protein acquisition. Documented instances of mortality attributable to nutritional deprivation commenced appearing throughout the demographic, disproportionately affecting the geriatric population and those afflicted with pre-existing medical conditions. The temporal epoch spanning January through March 1945 represented the manifestation of maximal catastrophe. The disbursement mechanisms for nutritional allocations became irregularly functional, subsequently discontinuing entirely for successive intervals spanning multiple weeks. Family units resorted to boiling tulip bulbs, botanical matter possessing toxic characteristics yet providing marginal caloric utility. Agricultural byproducts typically designated for livestock consumption, specifically sugar beet derivatives, attained status as precious nutritional acquisitions. The mortality trajectory experienced dramatic acceleration throughout this interval. The April 1945 period encompassed the zenith of human suffering, notwithstanding meteorological progression toward springtime conditions. No nutritional reserves had maintained sufficient integrity to sustain through the winter duration. The mortality quantifications attained their maximum proportions during this interval. Parental figures observed their biological offspring progressively deteriorating, incapable of facilitating even marginal nutritional satisfaction. Subterranean repositories for deceased organisms were excavated in mass quantities. Entire regional communities approached proximate collapse of fundamental societal organization. The psychological devastation accompanying witnessing juvenile organisms succumb to deprivation remained comprehensively documented through survivor testimonials. Parental figures articulated anguish regarding their inability to maintain juvenile nutrition, describing the torment of daily observation. As offspring populations grew successively more enfeebled, articulating their necessity to implement impossible determinations regarding apportionment of inadequate provisions among multiple juvenile dependents. The emotional devastation was all-encompassing. The cognizance that biological offspring faced termination coupled with complete powerlessness to prevent such outcome. A female parental figure designated Anna Vandenberg, maintaining 3 juvenile dependents within Amsterdam, inscribed observations within her personal documentation during March 1945 articulating the following sentiment. Throughout this diurnal cycle, my youngest juvenile requested bread products. I maintained no bread substance to provide. She articulated vocal protests, subsequently ceased vocalizations because her physiological state permitted only abbreviated durations of emotional expression. She encompasses 7 rotations of solar cycles and perhaps 30 pounds of corporeal mass. My observation of her progressive deterioration occurs simultaneously with my complete inability to implement corrective intervention. Should American military forces not materialize in temporal proximity, her continued biological existence seems improbable. None of my offspring will endure. My supplication to divine providence requests sustenance, yet divinity appears as distant as the American military contingent. The juvenile demographic experienced the preponderant burden of the nutritional catastrophe due to the physiological reality that developing organisms necessitate nutritional input that proved simply inaccessible. Throughout this calamity, the physiological consequences of severe juvenile malnutrition underwent comprehensive documentation by Dutch medical practitioners who maintained meticulous clinical documentation despite operating within circumstances of extraordinary difficulty. The symptomatic manifestations followed predictable progression throughout the deterioration sequence. Initially, diminution of corporeal mass, subsequently deterioration of muscular tissues, then accumulation of fluid in bodily tissues consequent to protein insufficiency, ultimately cascading into organ system dysfunction precipitating mortality. Juvenile organisms essentially engaged in self-cannibalization of their own biological tissues to sustain rudimentary physiological functions. Their immunological defensive mechanisms underwent comprehensive collapse, rendering them vulnerable to pathogenic infections that would customarily constitute inconsequential concerns under ordinary circumstances. Educational institutions that retained nominal operational capacity transformed into repositories of observable torment. Pedagogical personnel documented instances of juvenile learners experiencing loss of consciousness attributable to nutritional insufficiency during instructional periods. Certain juvenile organisms possessed insufficient vigor to navigate to educational facilities. Other juvenile learners experienced cognitive shutdown at institutional workstations as energy conservation superseded instructional engagement priorities. The limited pedagogical personnel maintaining nutritional provisions would apportion diminutive quantities among juvenile learners, exhibiting most critical appearance of impending mortality. A medical practitioner identified as Henrik Mulder, operating within Rotterdam's medical facilities, providing therapeutic intervention to starving juvenile organisms throughout the crisis epoch, documented the medical reality confronting practitioners. He articulated the following observation. By March 1945, my therapeutic practice encompassed confrontation with juvenile organisms manifesting physiological conditions I had exclusively encountered within academic medical literature addressing famine-related pathology, protein malnutrition manifestations, nutritional deficiency diseases precipitating visual impairment and skeletal deformation, juvenile organisms aged 10 rotations of solar cycles possessing bodily mass, equivalent to healthy organisms aged 5 rotations. Numerous organisms had progressed beyond the threshold where nutritional intervention could facilitate salvage. Their organ systems had sustained deterioration too profound during months of deprivation. I could exclusively facilitate comfort, provision whilst their biological existence concluded. The psychological deterioration accompanying juvenile organisms subjected to persistent nutritional insufficiency demonstrated equivalent Devastation compared to the physiological manifestations, the perpetual condition of hunger progressively occupied the totality of their conscious cognitive processing. Juvenile organisms underwent transformation into lethargic, withdrawn entities, demonstrating incapacity for recreational engagement or participation in customary childhood activities characteristic of developmental normalcy. Certain juvenile individuals became preoccupied with conceptualization surrounding sustenance, engaging in continuous verbal articulation of dietary experiences recalled from pre-embargo temporal epochs. Alternative juvenile organisms terminated such discourse, the contemplation of unavailable provisions precipitating emotional anguish too profound to endure. Through continued vocalization, the neurological architecture of developing brains, already vulnerable to deprivation effects, sustained damage that would persist throughout their surviving years, manifesting as cognitive impairment, behavioral irregularities, and psychological sequelae from traumatic experiences. The capacity for hope itself underwent systematic erosion, replaced by resignation and fatalistic expectation of inevitable deterioration. Parental figures confronted the unbearable recognition that their biological offspring were experiencing torture through starvation, comprehending the distinction between that which occurred and what represented permissible humane treatment, yet possessing complete absence of capacity to implement remediation. The intergenerational transmission of trauma commenced during this interval, as children internalized the despair permeating their familial structures and communities. Survivors subsequently struggled throughout their existence with the psychological imprints of witnessing mortality, experiencing deprivation, and absorbing parental anguish during developmental epochs when psychological architecture underwent formation. The magnitude of this psychological devastation extended beyond quantifiable metrics, embedding itself within the consciousness of an entire demographic, shaping their comprehension of human vulnerability, societal fragility, and the rapidity with which civilization could descend into barbarity. Meanwhile, the Allied military command apparatus confronted strategic determinations of profound moral complexity. The military formations advancing through the European continent during early 1945 encountered competing imperatives of extraordinary difficulty. The geographic territory encompassing Western Netherlands did not position itself along the direct military advancement trajectory toward German heartland. The German military contingent deployed within that region failed to constitute significant military impediment to rapid Allied advancement. The reallocation of military resources toward accomplishment of Western Netherlands liberation would necessarily decelerate the momentum of military penetration into German territories and potentially prolong the totality of armed confrontation. However, the Allied military command hierarchy maintained consciousness regarding the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding within territories beyond their immediate military jurisdiction. Intelligence communications originating from covert Dutch resistance organizations, testimonials from civilian refugees who had managed escape, and documentation from reconnaissance operations collectively illuminated the starvation circumstances. The strategic calculus developed into a morally repugnant determination. Should military leadership prioritize the most expeditious military victory, while Dutch civilian populations experienced starvation mortality? Or should military resources undergo reallocation toward humanitarian relief operations? While the warfare persisted, the foundational determinations favored military advancement velocity. Western Netherlands would experience liberation as a downstream consequence of ultimate German capitulation, rather than through specific humanitarian military operations. Simultaneously, the Allied military apparatus endeavored to execute some relief measures through aerial delivery, mechanisms transporting sustenance to the geographically isolated and starving regions. These operations, designated Operation Manna by the Royal Air Force and Operation Chowhound by the United States Army Air Forces, commenced implementation during late April 1945 following diplomatic negotiations between Allied commanders and German command authorities. The German occupation command agreed to discontinue hostile fire directed at Allied aircraft, executing humanitarian supply missions, representing perhaps the sole instance where opposing belligerents coordinated actions to facilitate civilian survival during the conflict's final phases. British and American bombardment aircraft, which had previously transported destructive weaponry toward German metropolitan centers and military installations, underwent transformation into platforms for humanitarian commodity distribution. These aerial vehicles deposited provisions across delineated geographic zones, where starving populations could access them. The aerial distribution initiatives furnished crucial provisional relief, yet possessed inherent limitations, preventing comprehensive crisis resolution. The supplies dispersed reached exclusively a fraction of the affected demographic. The distribution mechanisms remained chaotic and inefficiently organized. Most crucially, juvenile organisms already approaching terminal starvation required immediate sustained nutritional therapy that periodic aerial deliveries could never furnish. The complete liberation of Western Netherlands, through ground military operations and subsequent systematic provisioning of nutritional commodities, remained the indispensable requirement for humanitarian salvation. The arrival of ground military formations through Western Netherlands in early May 1945, occurring contemporaneously with German military capitulation, revealed humanitarian circumstances that substantially exceeded the comprehensiveness of intelligence communications that had been disseminated throughout the Allied command structure. The numerical documentation had enumerated mortality statistics and malnutrition quantifications. The documentation had demonstrated itself insufficient for conveying the tangible reality confronting those who directly observed entire population aggregates teetering upon the precipice of organizational collapse. American and Canadian military formations advancing into Western Netherlands encountered populations that simultaneously craved liberation desperately, yet lacked the physiological vitality to manifest this yearning. Through customary celebratory behavioral expressions, the archetypal liberation scenarios, featuring enthusiastic choreography throughout thoroughfares, vociferous celebrations, and floral presentations directed toward military personnel, underwent replacement by more restrained yet profoundly emotionally intense responses, emanating from populations who had endured months of intentional nutritional deprivation.
The activities provided to liberated Dutch children transcended mere entertainment. They represented deliberate psychological rehabilitation through normalization. Systematic provision of ordinary childhood experiences functioned as therapeutic intervention for populations deprived of normal childhood. Children participated in recreational programs, rediscovering their capacity for joy and hope. They engaged in education, recognizing renewed prospects for their futures. They experienced security and predictability, fundamental prerequisites for psychological healing. The relationships between military personnel and children provided psychological grounding that extended far beyond the immediate period. Children learned that soldiers possess capacity for compassion and genuine concern for their welfare, contradicting their prior understanding of soldiers exclusively as instruments of violence. For many, these relationships represented their first encounter with consistent adults, demonstrating unconditional positive regard. The psychological impact proved profound, establishing foundations for healing and future healthy relationships. Nutritional rehabilitation proceeded gradually. Initial provisioning emphasized nutrient-dense foods and supplements. Medical practitioners carefully monitored weight progression, ensuring appropriate recovery velocity. Children transitioned from liquid supplements to solid foods as their digestive systems adapted. Muscle tissue, previously deteriorated from malnutrition, progressively rebuilt. Neurological structures damaged through deprivation underwent partial recovery. Bone density, compromised through insufficient calcium absorption, slowly restored. Complete recuperation extended substantially beyond the immediate post-liberation period. Many children required years for full physical restoration. Certain individuals harbored residual medical complications persisting throughout their lives. Growth patterns remained disrupted for some survivors, their ultimate stature reduced compared to what would have occurred without deprivation. Some developed chronic health conditions attributable to childhood malnutrition. Psychological recovery similarly demonstrated extended temporal requirements. Certain survivors struggled throughout their lives with anxiety disorders, hypervigilance regarding food availability, or obsessive behaviors surrounding nutritional security. The recuperation process represented not merely medical intervention, but profound human reconstruction requiring restoration at physiological, psychological, emotional, and spiritual dimensions.